Welcome, quiet soul. You always hear what others miss. Today you are the listener history has been waiting for. In medieval Europe, a single loaf of bread could send you to the gallows. A stray sentence about God could set you ablaze before a crowd. And behind every wooden gate or stone wall waited 1,000 punishments so grotesque they would make modern misdeeds, petty theft, blasphemous doubt, even silence seem like death sentences in disguise. It was an era when a human life cost less than a coat, less than a careless word, less than the absence of a nod. And while you may choose to call it barbaric, superstitious, bloodthirsty, what cannot be denied is that our ancestors lived through it, trembled within it, and ultimately vanished into a world where justice wore the shape of a meat hook and a cross soaked in blood. In today's episode, you'll follow us into the blackest folds of what they once called fairness, a place where law was written not with parchment and pen but with rope, with iron, and with the silence of those who no longer had anyone left to pray for them. Brace yourself for what waits in the chapters ahead isn't history. It's a confession that never got whispered. In England, every large town had its gibbet, a public hanging post. Death wasn't hidden behind stone walls or buried in silence. It was displayed in the open air where each swaying corpse became a breathing sermon for those still teetering between sin and salvation. You would walk through the marketplace, reach for your bread, and lift your gaze only to meet him someone who once walked like you, lived like you, and now hung slack with hollow eyes, mouth agape, beard crawling with flies as if the devil himself had scooped out his soul before God could offer the final rites. Sounds like a nightmare to a medieval mind that was just a weekday. But here's where your certainty may begin to falter, because even horrors that brutal still couldn't stop people from committing crimes. In the year 1202, in the small northern English town of Lincoln, home to barely 7,000 souls, the records show 114 murders, 89 armed robberies, 65 serious assaults, one small town, one sea of blood. And how many people do you think were sentenced to death? 2. Only 2. One body dangled in the town square, another stiffened in a field of grass. The rest, they disappeared through bribes, through flight, or simply because no one cared enough to chase them. The question back then was no longer who committed the crime. It was who gets chosen to be the cautionary corpse. Because justice in those days didn't follow the principle of equality, it was a crooked scale, and while you stood trembling on one end, the weight on the other wasn't truth or fact, but power wealth, and your proximity to the church. You could be a poor farmer caught stealing turnips and end up hanging from a rope. Or you could be a knight who stabbed a man in a tavern brawl and walk free after donating a new bell to the chapel. Medieval justice did not wear a blindfold like the goddess we know today. It saw everything, and it chose. Not based on right or wrong, but on who deserved to be made an example of beneath the eyes of the crowd. So people didn't survive by virtue or moral conviction. They survived by knowing when to bow, when to disappear from the church's gaze, and sometimes, most importantly, when to say nothing at all even in the face of injustice. Now we leave the courtroom behind and step into something darker, a place where a single sentence could ignite your entire life. There was a time when words were no longer a means of communication, but incantations of life or death. In that time, a mistimed question, a furrowed brow during Mass, or even the quiet pause of someone too stunned to say Amen. During a sermon on devotion, any one of those might be enough to brand you a blasphemer, drag you out to the tolling of cathedral bells, and burn you alive in the square as a holy offering. Blasphemy required no weapon, no evidence, no victim left bleeding. All it needed was an accuser, perhaps a jealous neighbour, a power-hungry official clearing his path, or a priest desperate for a sacrifice to reignite the fading faith of his flock. And once the accusation left someone's lips, no one really cared what you had actually said, because the moment the words offence against God were uttered, they drowned out every voice that might have defended you. And so, the pyre was built. You think you could explain yourself? In those days, Thomas Aquinas, the famed theologian, once wrote, "To kill a man is to destroy a creature of God, but to blaspheme is to offend the Creator himself." And with that logic, many murderers were spared, while those who merely misspoke were set ablaze. A quiet cough during Mass, a passing joke, even a grieving father asking his wife, "If God is merciful, why did our child die so young?" Any of these could be enough for a priest to cross your name out of humanity. In England, you'd be led away to the tolling of church bells tied to a wooden stake soaked in pine oil and lit from the feet up. In Spain, the cord around your neck would twist tighter and tighter, accompanied by whispered prayers. In Germany, they cut out your tongue first to ensure you would never again sin by speaking. And in parts of the Middle East there were sentences where a great sacred elephant would walk slowly toward you, its weight ordained by God until your skull was crushed beneath his judgment. Worse still, blasphemy had no clear boundaries. You could never quite know whether you were still on solid ground or had already stepped into hell. Some were executed simply for repeating a heretic's words, even to condemn them. Others for recounting a dream in which God wept. And some for the sole crime of staying silent when the crowd cried, Amen. That fear seeped into sleep. People learned to laugh on cue, breathe in, rhythm nod when expected, bow when uncertain, and above all never ask why. Because back then, a question was a spark in a forest of dry faith. A single word of wonder could become a forest fire of suspicion. You could steal a horse, rob a merchant, even kill a man, and still hope for mercy. But if you dared to question God even once, no priest would hear your confession. You were no longer human. You became unclean, a defiler, a heretic, kindling for the holy fire of divine justice. In our modern age, when someone is murdered, the crime scene is sealed, forensic teams arrive, surveillance is reviewed, and evidence gradually emerges into the light. But in the Middle Ages, light never reached what happened behind the church, and most crimes vanished with the one who committed them. There were no DNA files, no national registries, no phones, no satellites, no all-seeing eye to catch the flick of a wrist or the glint of a dagger, except perhaps for a God whom people sometimes conveniently chose not to hear. And in that vacuum, murder became the perfect crime, a knife drawn in the dark. A blow struck from behind the horse stalls, a body pushed into a dry well or quietly slipped into the current of a river at dusk. No evidence, no witness, no one willing to get involved because even a glance in the killer's direction might make you the next to simply vanish. And most importantly, no one was looking for the killer anyway. Medieval law did not function like ours does today. Except for a few Italian cities with paid watchmen, most towns and villages had no concept of a standing police force. What passed for law enforcement was left to the community, the village council or local militiamen, who more often than not committed as many crimes as they prevented. The medieval landscape was a patchwork quilt of forest paths, untamed fields and isolated hamlets. Between two villages could stretch miles of wilderness, unmonitored, unnamed, unchecked. Once a murderer stepped out of the circle of light, he disappeared into shadow, and the shadows owed no explanations. There were towns where it said everyone knew who the killer was, but no one spoke, because he was the priest's son, because he was the Lord's nephew, or worse, because he was the only man in the village who knew how to cure winter fevers. And when justice is no longer a system but a faint whisper carried on uncertain winds, people lived by instinct alone. The good learned to avoid the bad learned to sin in silence, and the dead had no voice. Old records from the time reveal that in places like London and Oxford, your odds of being murdered were higher than your chances of dying in an accident. You could lose your life over an unpaid debt, a misplaced step in a tavern, or because you stared too long at another man's wife, and then no one would know. No one would care. No one would follow up. In fact, there were killings where the murderer never even fled. He stood right there in the marketplace, slicing meat, attending mass, laughing in the open, because he knew that no one wanted to become a witness in a world where witness was the shortest role you could play in life. And so murder became a game of power, of silence, of knowing the loopholes in every law, and understanding that sometimes chaos made the finest cloak for a man already soaked in blood. Among all the crimes of the Middle Ages, theft may have seemed the smallest, no blood spilled, no heads rolled, but in truth it was the clearest mirror of how justice could twist itself into something biased, chaotic and cruel. Not because stealing was the gravest sin, but because it was the most common one, and thus the perfect playground for judges to punish or pardon however they saw fit a word that so often disguised prejudice, social hierarchy, and sometimes just a flicker of mood. You could steal a cloak drying on a riverside branch like the 15-year-old boy from the village of Mihavel in southern France did in 1353, and be banished for 3 months, a sentence soft and almost merciful, as if the village believed that youth itself was a kind of atonement that could be paid in time away from familiar eyes. But in that very same year, in a corner of London, another man was hanged not for murder, but for stealing a horse, a few rolls of cloth and some assorted goods from a warehouse. No blood was spilled, no one was harmed, no screams had time to rise, and still he died. Was it that the stolen objects carried souls of their own? Or did the city he lived in, its roofs taller, its walls thicker, also carry a bloodier standard for what possessions were worth dying over? The answer lies deeper, buried in the dust of local legal codes, in the tilt of a judge's head, and in the blurred tale of names like the Warrant family, a clan from the village of Saul in Norfolk, whose court records read like a long-running play full of repeated thefts, repeated arrests and repeated escapes from consequence, as if every indictment was part of a melody that never reached its final note. They stole from petty trinkets to bolts of cloth worth 2 months' wages for a labourer. They were caught, imprisoned, threatened with torture, even once sentenced to four dur, strong and harsh, a flowery term cloaking real brutality, and yet somehow they always walked free. No gallows, no final judgment. And when the pattern repeated itself too perfectly, people began to whisper. Maybe they knew how to smile at the right moment. Maybe they gifted cloth to the jailer. Maybe they were far more cunning than their threadbare clothes suggested. Or maybe they knew that the price of innocence wasn't written in law, but tucked into a pouch beneath a frayed tunic. But there were those who didn't know, and they the ones who stole out of hunger, who stole because their child's cries rattled through the night, who stole because no one in the village would loan them another crust of bread. They became the dried corpses swaying from the gates. Not for what they took, but because they didn't know how to survive in a world where guilt could be exchanged for silver, and innocence had no currency if you didn't know the priest sipping wine with the magistrate. So among thieves, some were exiled, some were hanged, and some simply vanished from the records as if they had never existed. And each time a sentence was delivered, the crowd nodded. Fingers moved across rosary beads, crosses were signed in the air, but no one asked, did he really deserve to die? They only thought, thank God it wasn't me this time. In a world where every path could lead to the gallows, the church once stood as the only place a criminal could run to and live. No gun, no title. All you needed was to cross the threshold of stone, and once the bells began to toll, no matter who you had stabbed in the marketplace, you became temporarily untouchable. It wasn't mercy, it was law. And that law for centuries was carved into wood, etched into stone, and burned into the minds of those who ran breathless blood, still wet on their hands, with death breathing down their necks. They called it sanctuary, the sacred right of asylum, a shield that protected anyone who could reach the altar, no matter what sin stained their soul. In most of Europe, the sanctuary held for 40 days, but in England, if you made it inside, you could stay forever so long as you agreed to vanish from your homeland. Exile, not execution. Silence, not salvation. Imagine you are a hunted man guilty of murder, whether by intent or accident, and you're running heart-pounding blood loud in your ears toward the great doors of the church. You bang on them like a madman, and when they finally open, you collapse onto the cold stone floor beneath the statue of the Virgin Mary. At that moment, all your pursuers must stop. The guards cannot enter, the officials must wait, and you, though far from forgiven, are still alive. It was precisely this power that turned the sacred into shelter, and shelter into loophole. Not all who crossed the threshold sought redemption. Many simply sought escape, and worse, some bow in hand took to the cathedral's stained glass windows, aiming arrows through coloured light toward the men stationed in the courtyard. Criminals shielded by sacred vaults, justice halted by the sound of sacred hymns. But sometimes even the so-called house of God became a stage for something darker, a theatre of crime where the audience was not the townspeople, but the silent angels carved into the ceiling. In the year 1284 at St Mary le Bow Church in London, a man named Lawrence Duquette ran inside after a street altercation. He had insulted the lover of a powerful man named Ralph, and now he knew he was being hunted. He made it in. He followed the law. He believed he was safe. But when night fell, a group of figures slipped in through the rear door led by the very woman he had offended earlier that day. No shouting, no trial. Only a rope, the hush of vengeance, and a stone mullion high above from which they hanged him right there in the holiest space in the city. By morning his body was found, and reflexively the townsfolk assumed it was a suicide remorse. They whispered. They cut him down, dumped his body in a ditch and closed the book. But then someone stepped forward, a silent witness, hidden in the pews, and that witness told everything, every footstep, every groan of the rope, every silhouette flickering in candlelight. The result, 15 men were sentenced to hang, and the woman Alice was burned alive in the square. From that moment on, people no longer saw the church as a place filled solely with hymns and confession. because once evil had crossed through the house of God, it did not kneel. It simply waited for the bells to ring again to muffle the sound of yet another body hitting stone. For centuries, long before neuroscience existed, long before anyone understood trauma or the dark landscape of depression, a person who took their own life was not seen as a victim, but as a criminal. Not a criminal against the self, not a criminal against the family, but a criminal against God, against the king, and against the entire feudal order that held the world upright with its chains and its doctrine of submission. In the eyes of the church, suicide was the ultimate rebellion. If God was the giver of breath, then the one who ended their life had snatched that breath away, not just from themselves, but from heaven's hands. And to the eyes of feudal lords, a person was no soul, they were property, a chattel inscribed beneath the name of their lord. To commit suicide was not escape. It was vandalism, a destruction of royal assets, and in some regions it was punished more severely than theft. So death instead of release simply marked the beginning of a new set of punishments, ones that clung to the flesh long after the spirit had gone. In 15th century France, the law declared that if someone took their own life, their house was to be torn down, their fields, burned, their trees cut to stumps, as if the land itself must pay for giving birth to a rebellious soul. In England, they drove a stake through the corpse's heart and buried it at the crossroads, where the four winds would tear the blood and sorrow in every direction, ensuring that the spirit could never find its way home. They believed that a suicide became a ghost, not because of sorrow, but because God refused them and no other place would take them in. The stake was not punishment. It was a pin nailing the soul to the earth, as if the earthly world still had unfinished business with them. And if that wasn't enough, if the soul still howled through the night, they put their faith in the crossroads. Because in folk belief, a lost soul would not know which direction to turn, and after wandering long enough it would forget why it returned at all. Forget the one it loved. Forget the pain that ended it, and dissolve into the wind quietly. The property of a person who died by suicide, of course, was seized in full. No one was allowed to inherit. No one could keep the coat, the silver spoon, or even the final plank of wood. Their children were branded as cursed blood, unworthy of building a future on the land of their ancestors. And the spouse, husband, or wife would go on living in a house where the stains had been scrubbed from the floor, but where the wind still slipped through the cracks in the wall like a question no one ever dared to answer. There was no funeral, no bells, no flowers, no prayer, only silence, only cold, and the bowed eyes of an entire village, as if to say, "You chose to leave, so you're no longer one of us." And that was how the medieval world understood those who could endure no longer. Not as people who needed saving, not as souls who needed to be held, but as criminals nailed down after death and cursed to loneliness that echoed through the very spine of history. There was one kind of criminal you would never see stealing, stabbing, or fleeing into the night. He wore robes. He sat still upon a carved wooden chair. He nodded solemnly and gestured for the next person to step forward. And when he spoke, death became innocence, wrong was renamed, and right went silent. The Middle Ages were not only filled with men who sinned by blade or hand or blasphemous word, they were ruled by those who sinned through power, through the well-timed nod in a courtroom, through the casual omission of a fact deemed unconvincing. And so corruption slipped into history not as an intruder, but as the rightful heir to a justice system already rotting from the inside. In 1249, a group of merchants from Brabant, now part of modern-day Belgium, travelled to England to trade. They were robbed in broad daylight in Hampshire, a bustling commercial hub home to the port of Southampton, and the Palace of Winchester, a place where law was supposedly civilised and firm. They reported the crime. They filed complaints. Suspects were arrested. A trial was opened, and then they were all acquitted. Nothing happened. Except one thing, the merchants refused to stay silent. They kept appealing higher and louder until the case reached the royal court and landed at the feet of King Henry III. An internal investigation was launched not to solve the robbery, but to understand why no one had been convicted in a case as obvious as daylight. What they uncovered was a tangled web of deception, a jury that wasn't a jury but a chorus of accomplices, men handpicked to judge who had once divided loot with the thieves, clinked mugs with them in roadside inns and helped stash stolen goods beneath the altar of a parish church. Justice, it seemed, was not defeated from the outside, it had been bled dry from the spine inward. And people like the Warrant family of Norfolk, repeat thieves whose records were scrubbed clean year after year, they weren't lucky, and the villagers weren't afraid. They just knew how to split the winnings. Perhaps a vanished bolt of cloth became a warm supper for the court's quartermaster. Perhaps a silver coin found its way behind the clerk's ledger. Perhaps the man recording the minutes that day was the brother-in-law of the woman next door to the warrants. And when every chair in the courtroom was cushioned with favours and silent deals, then guilt no longer depended on what you did, but on whether or not you knew how to play the game. By the year 1350, things reached their boiling point. Sir William Thorpe, the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, the man who was meant to be the sharpest sword in the Crown's hand, was convicted for taking bribes on a massive scale. A judge brought down not by whistleblowers, but simply because he had taken so much that even the throne could no longer stomach the smell. So if you lived in those days and found yourself accused, what you needed wasn't a lawyer, wasn't evidence, wasn't a witness. What you needed was a name on the jury list, a handshake at the right moment, a wink from behind the chapel wall. And if you didn't have that, you were no longer a person standing before justice. You were a pawn sacrificed in a game where the pieces had already been arranged behind your back by hands stained with ink, stained with blood, and stained with coins that still glistened with the sweat of the wrongly condemned. And if you've followed this journey to its bitter end, perhaps you've come to see what justice meant in the Middle Ages, that crime did not always begin with a blade, but with the hands that held the cross, with the pen that scratched your name into a courtroom ledger, and with the eyes that turned away at just the right moment. It was an age built on fear, where punishment was sanctified into ritual, where justice didn't rest on a scale, but sat quietly inside the pocket of whoever had the right friends. We've seen murderers vanish into the woods, blasphemers burned alive for asking a question, thieves sentenced to death, not for what they took, but because they had nothing to shield them. We've walked through church doors where killers hid like wolves beneath a priest's robe and watched as a man who could no longer bear his pain was buried not as a soul in despair, but as a traitor to God, to king, to humanity. And at last we entered the courtroom where the light of justice was meant to shine, only to find that those in jurors' robes, judges' chairs, and priestly garb were the ones directing the farce, where verdicts were bartered, where deaths became sacrifices, and where some souls were never granted a final prayer because they didn't know the right name to whisper at the altar. Of course, some will say, that was long ago. Some will insist, those days were savage, we've evolved, we're civilized now. But are we, or do we still live in a world where guilt depends on what class you belong to, where the poor are branded as irresponsible, where the powerless must ask permission to be angry, where the voice that speaks the truth doesn't echo nearly as far as a handshake behind a velvet curtain? And if that is true, then perhaps we should not be so quick to turn our backs on history, not to assign blame, not to dwell in sorrow, but to look closely to see that the shadow of ancient prisons still lingers on the very walls we lean against today. Maybe no one is impaled through the heart anymore for taking their own life. Maybe no one is burned at the stake for a misspoken word in the square. But the silent deaths in psychiatric wards and detention centres in news blurbs no longer than a sigh, they still happen. And sometimes not because someone was wrong, but because they had no one to stand beside them. This journey does not end with an answer. It ends with a question you must carry home. Had you lived in the Middle Ages, would you have escaped the gallows? And now living in the present, can you be certain you've escaped the invisible ones? And if one day you find yourself angry, powerless, or unwilling to look away, remember this. History is not here to glorify the victors. History exists so we may finally see who was forgotten,